and then we'll get started. Welcome to today's discussion, the sixth session of The Breakdown, where Steve Levitsky and I talk about the struggle for democracy in the United States, reflect on historical precedents in the US and abroad, and offer evidence-based reflections on the path forward. My name is Erica Chenoweth. I'm the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm speaking in my individual capacity as a scholar. Before we begin, I have a few brief announcements. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. A couple of logistics. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterward. The video will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel, and we encourage your participation. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure there's ample time for audience questions. Before we go further, let me introduce Stephen Levitsky, who's the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Steve's research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, particularly in Latin America. He's co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 30 languages, and Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. So, Steve, we get together on this call once a month, and it seems like from one month to the next, there are about 36 things that we could focus on in our conversation. But what I want to start us off with today is just a conversation about what we saw happen in Hungary a couple of weeks ago. I've been dying to hear your reactions to that. We haven't gotten a chance to talk before now, so might as well talk about it in front of everyone. So just to remind the audience, in case you didn't know, Viktor Orban, who'd been basically in power in Hungary for well over a decade, almost, I think, 16 years, was running against a new opponent, a relative newcomer in terms of identifying as an opponent. He came from within the ruling party and defected from it and started a new formation and ran kind of a center-right campaign, but also a strong kind of anti-corruption and anti-establishment campaign, in this sense viewing Orban's government as the establishment. And there were a number of other things too, claims that the opposition party put forward, but the main bottom line is that they had a decisive victory at the polls, and Peter Magyar, the head of the party, will be the new leader of Hungary for all intents and purposes. There's definitely a lot to say, a lot to learn about this case. What do you think of it, Steve, given that Hungary has been one of the sort of focal examples of illiberal democracy, in Orban's own words, and a good case of what you've described as competitive authoritarianism?
Yeah, I think competitive authoritarianism is a better term than illiberal democracy. I don't think there is such a thing as an illiberal democracy. Without liberalism, you can't certainly can't sustain and probably can't have democracy. But I think this is very, very good news. I think it reminds us that the global democracy is not in as I guess one-way retreat as we sometimes tend to think and to hear. There are important cases of backsliding in the world, but there have across the world, not only in Hungary, but across the world, been a number of cases of pushing back and rolling back authoritarianism. So there are challenges and crises in democracies across the world, but we're not in a moment of dramatic authoritarian expansion. Democracies continue, democracies and Democrats, small d Democrats, continue to put up a fight all over the world. And this was a really momentous and important case. Another really important lesson that we sometimes forget is oppositions can win unfair elections. The election in Hungary was not fair. The electoral system was heavily gerrymandered to favor the incumbent party. And Orban had established over the course of the last 15 years an almost total monopoly over the traditional media, over television and the main newspapers and radio stations. The Magyar got no access to almost no access to television whatsoever during the campaign. So this was a classic uneven playing field, a tilted playing field against the opposition, and Magyar won. And so that's not only is that a testament to Magyar's political strength, but it should remind us that even when incumbents abuse power, even when they stack the deck, even when they cheat, they still sometimes lose. And we shouldn't wish for such a situation anywhere. But I think it's important for oppositions to not give up just because the other side is abusing power, and that's been part of our conversation in all of our sessions. So, in that sense, I think American citizens should take note and should take heart. I think it's important to also, just to close, to remember there are ways in which the U.S. and Hungary are quite different. And shocking as this may sound to some, Orban actually played by the rules and obeyed the law in a much more consistent fashion than Trump. So it's great news that Orban stacked the deck, still lost, and gave up power. But that doesn't mean that the Republicans in the United States will give up power as easily and not resort to measures that Orban did not resort to. I think there is, I worry a little bit about complacency looking at what happened in Hungary and thinking, well, it can be, relatively easy for the Democrats, in this case, the big D Democrats, to return to power in the United States. They might, but Trump's shown a willingness to just flat out break the law and to engage in violence that Orban never did. And so we still have to be really vigilant.
Yeah, that's really useful as a reminder that in many of the breakthrough cases that we've seen of democratic transitions around the world over the past 40 years, it's happened precisely through the mechanism of elections that were happening in places where elections were deliberately designed to reinforce the incumbent's power and authority. And somehow the opposition was able to effectively unite into a very broad, honestly, anti-incumbent coalition, right? And that can take many different stripes. There are different ideologies that can be represented under such a broad-based coalition. But the basic formation is an anti-incumbent one, not necessarily agreeing about everything else, right? And so that also suggests vulnerabilities for consolidating the Democratic victory after such an election. And that's been a challenge for many countries around the world over the past really 40 years, which is that a strong anti-authoritarian movement is often necessary to have the breakthrough. But then after the breakthrough, these movements can be very vulnerable to, a resurgent kind of authoritarian election afterward. And so without being able to put forward a political program that's very appealing and follow through and deliver on the things they said they would do, it can be quite vulnerable to a counter mobilization.
Yeah, I think there are two challenges there that are worth highlighting. One is keeping pro-democratic forces united to clean up and reform the system, because you have almost inevitably a state bureaucracy and institutions that have been packed and corrupted and in many cases weakened by the previous government. This has been a real challenge in Poland, where liberal democratic forces have now been in power for 3 years, but they've had a really difficult time rooting out corrupt and authoritarian elements within the state. I think the Magyar government is going to be much more aggressive, and luckily has a massive parliamentary majority to be able to do it. I think they're going to be much more aggressive in kind of purging the state of authoritarian and corrupt elements. And that's double-edged. There are a whole series of debates about that, but I think the Americans should be watching both Poland and Hungary. The other challenge, in addition to just simply kind of cleaning up the state after an authoritarian episode, is the one you pointed to, which I think is even more difficult, which is actually coming up with an alternative programmatic agenda that appeals to a majority of citizens over time. And there, Magyar is going to try a fairly kind of center-right approach, a fairly liberal conservative approach. In the United States, I think the alternative will almost certainly be more center-left. But that just is a remaining challenge for democratic forces. There's not yet a program or an ideology that can excite people the way that the far right does in the 21st century West.
Yeah. Maybe Brazil is another example that's sort of in progress in this regard, which is to say that there was an election that ousted Bolsonaro from power and brought Lula back. And the fragility of that of that coalition is on display all the time. At the same time, Bolsonaro has been held accountable for the coup attempt in ways that hasn't been possible in the U.S. But what do you make of Lula's kind of trajectory going forward?
Well, I mean, the Brazilians, excuse me, have done better, certainly better than the Biden administration did in kind of cleaning up and holding accountable those who assaulted democratic institutions. The guy who tried to undermine Brazilian elections is in prison today, which is a far cry. The guy who tried to undermine our elections in the United States is in the White House today. So in that sense, Brazilians did much better. But politics is hard, and incumbents
Yeah.
are not popular these days. And Lula's old, and Lula is in a statistical tie with Bolsonaro's son in this year's presidential elections. And so, politics is really hard. It's not always as we would like. It is not clear whether Lula will win re-election. I think Brazilian democratic institutions have proven resilient enough that even if Bolsonaro's son wins the presidency, I don't expect a lot of backsliding, but you always want to keep authoritarians out of power.
Right. So maybe we can return stateside and talk a little bit about what's been going on in the U.S. There's a lot. Last week or the week prior, there was an indictment of the Southern Poverty Law Center that is a federal indictment from a grand jury bringing charges about wire fraud and things like that. And the main claim is that the Southern Poverty Law Center misused donor funds. And the context is that the SPLC had provided remuneration to informants to try to share information then with federal law enforcement authorities prior to major kind of far-right neo-Nazi or Klan actions. And are now being, charged with federal crimes. One of the things that has been interesting and perhaps somewhat distinct from what we might have seen a year ago in this context is that there's been an overwhelming response condemning this indictment and the targeting of the SPLC by many, hundreds or even thousands of nonprofit organizations and civil rights organizations and legal organizations really trying to rally to stand up for the ability of civil society to be autonomous and to not be singled out for targeting and punishment by the government. And yet, the potential impacts of this could be very far-reaching, not just for the SPLC, but for the broader kind of ecosystem of civil rights organizations. What do you think of when you heard the news about the sort of federal charges being brought against the SPLC?
Well, this is classic authoritarian behavior. Authoritarians, it is what in Latin America we call lawfare, the use of prosecutors, the use of the law in a selective, targeted way to go after critics and political opponents. This is Orban didn't do it quite so much, but something that Chavez did in Venezuela, that Rafael Correa did in Ecuador, that's been widespread in Turkey and obviously in Putin's Russia. And the Trump administration has been seeking to prosecute critics really across the board. It is kind of failed miserably in many cases of really prominent national political critics, people like Jim Comey and some sitting elected officials, senators. Those efforts have been sort of bumbling and failed. But there have been a series of attacks on media outlets and civil society organizations. Media Matters is one, Act Blue is another, and most recently, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that I think have been effective in several ways. First of all, you don't have to achieve a conviction to seriously punish civil society organizations. Many of these civil society organizations are not they're not super well funded. And going to court, defending themselves in court is a really, really costly endeavor. It is taxing. It generates a ton of anxiety. It drains resources tremendously. Very often leads civil society organizations to lay people off, to cease doing the work that they want to be doing because they're defending themselves, and in some cases to have to shutter entirely. And it also sends a powerful message to other civil society organizations who are to know that just being brought up on charges, just having to go to court, just having to lawyer up can be crippling. And so this seems like just another example of that. Without getting into the details of the case, I think this is clearly an episode of trying to use the law to bully, intimidate, harass, and weaken civic opposition. Again, the Trump administration has had a mixed record at best in actually securing prosecution. I would say less than that. It's been pretty unsuccessful. But as an intimidating device and weakening civil society organizations and sometimes draining them of resources and costing them access to funding, it's been somewhat successful.
Yeah, I mean, what really strikes me about this case so far is the reaction of others across the sort of civil society and business ecosystem to this. To be clear, the SPLC has been accused of a crime, but not convicted of one, right? And yet, there was news that came out yesterday that both Fidelity and Vanguard were preventing donor-advised funds in their control from being used to support the SPLC. And this is, an organization that has not been convicted of a crime, right? And yet the signal that the government's actions about it and its sort of acceptability as an autonomous organization does damage anyway, right? So I think there's everything that you said really aligns with my take as well. I would say a couple of other interesting international examples are related to claims about, say, foreign agents, right? So the law that Putin passed that was one of the most damaging laws was this sort of foreign agents law that then we saw proliferate across different backsliding contexts, including India, that shut down the operations of many nonprofits and civil society groups in those countries because they received, any funding, for example, from a U.S. foundation or a U.S. NGO, a U.S. quasi-governmental or governmental agency for civil society and rule of law support. And so, the word lawfare, I think, is right, which is to say, there's like a plausible reason why that they can sort of justify, like on security grounds or something, the restriction of a sector, but then the way that it's applied or enforced is clearly to try to either bully or put out of business autonomous civil society in general. So let's talk a little bit about the other big news that's just breaking yesterday about the Calais decision in the Supreme Court and its implications for the Voting Rights Act. You and Dan, in your book, How Democracies Die, talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act and its implications for helping the United States to finally realize, at least on paper, its potential as a multiracial democracy and the necessity of legal and enforceable instruments to ensure a multiracial democracy in the US. So what was your reaction to the news that the court had dramatically restricted the way that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act can be applied going forward, and effectively eliminating that the sort of element that required or that protected anyway race conscious districts in the US?
Yeah, I guess I have two answers to that question. I mean, at the end of the day, I found it pretty devastating. This has been coming for a while, and it really it predates Trump. There has been a movement among conservatives and within the court to dismantle the Voting Rights Act for a long time. This has been, reporting suggests this has been a mission of John Roberts since his days in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. So this has been a long-term project to dismantle the Voting Rights Act, which I think, as you noted, that's what made the United States a modern democracy. That's what allowed us to call ourselves a modern democracy, was when we passed the Civil and Voting Rights Act, which extended and protected civil and voting rights for all of our citizens. And I tend to share Ruth Bader Ginsburg's statement a few years ago that eliminating the Voting Rights Act because there aren't cases of egregious denial of African American right to vote is like throwing away an umbrella in the rain because you're not getting wet. The Voting Rights Act was working, and I think it's impossible for me to say with any certainty what will happen, but I think we have dismantled a critical protection in an area that is always from the day that this republic was created, always been a threat to democracy, to equality, to freedom in this country, right? Racial injustice has always been a looming threat. And we finally built up a set of very important legal and legislative protections, and now we're dismantling them. So I think it is potentially very, very risky for our democracy going forward. I'm a bit more mixed about racial gerrymanders. I don't think they're necessary for democracy. And so that particular part of the Voting Rights Act, I don't think is necessarily devastating. I think that the problem is the dismantling of the whole. In fact, the prior ruling was worse in the sense that it really began to gut and dismantle the system of oversight and protection against efforts to deny our citizens access to the vote.
Yeah, I think a decision like this has a lot of really unpredictable effects, right? In part because of the way that that states then will adjust. how they approach districting and elections going forward. And it can also give rise to some very kind of anti-democratic moves right away. One of the things that we have seen today is Louisiana officials announcing that they're canceling their May 16th primary, in which some people have already voted, apparently, to redraw maps based on the ruling. And this is, perhaps, in a very strict way, legally justified based on the Supreme Court decision, but in a normative kind of small d democratic way, is deeply concerning. And so it can sort of give rise to these other anti-democratic moves and interfere with elections, or create uncertainty and kind of chaos around the elections that that can be deeply damaging to their security, to people's trust in the elections process, and their, the overall outlook of how they break down in the end. The other thing that I thought, and I haven't actually read the decision carefully, but I've read some commentary about it, is the implication that it's just much harder to demonstrate or bring claims that can stand around racial discrimination. And that one of the pieces of evidence that can't be admitted or that won't be considered is the impacts on people, right? So, for example, if Black voter participation declines, if turnout goes down, that might not necessarily be like valid evidence unless there's proof that the intention was to drive it down, right? And I just think like that part of the jurisprudence changing in that way will have implications for lots of different types of claims of discrimination going forward. Yes, I think it's a very far-reaching decision. And the immediate aftermath of it in impacting the elections and the primary season itself already is very striking.
Yeah. I mean, I'm deeply disturbed by this move to establish as sort of the official line in this country is now that racism is no longer a problem and that we don't need any kinds of public policies that are sensitive to or provide any oversight in terms of racial discrimination. That it's sort of we are told by the state, we're told officially that racism is not a problem and we're not allowed to try to combat it. And I think we know very well what the consequences of that are. The other concern, which you alluded to, is we are now this is just going to accelerate a wave of win at any cost gerrymandering, which is a deeply, I mean, gerrymandering has always existed in the United States, and it's always been a very undemocratic process. But it is becoming more open. It's been partisan gerrymandering has been not only blessed, but even embraced by the Supreme Court. So it's got full legitimacy. The wind is back, and it is now, I think, likely to be carried out repeatedly all the time wherever a party is able to do it. And the degree to which it distorts the vote, the degree to which you get a massive distortion between how people vote and the representatives that they get is extraordinary. And I think it's important to remember that there are few, if any, democracies in the world that allow gerrymandering. It existed in Hungary. Hungary was not a democratic regime, but it's hard to find a democracy where you get this kind of gerrymandering. It is an extraordinarily undemocratic process, and the Supreme Court has just allowed it to accelerate.
You mentioned that you didn't think that racial gerrymanders were really required for a multiracial democracy. Can you talk about, in the absence of it, what other electoral institutions or systems are available as alternatives to ensure kind of multiracial democratic power sharing?
Um, I mean, the argument for racial gerrymandering would be the inability in electorates in a constituency in which, say, African Americans were a minority, let's say 15, 20, 25% of a district or of a state, um, if they were systematically unable in our plurality electoral system, our first past the post electoral system, to elect representatives, because white candidates always won, um, that would be an argument for, I mean, there'd still be a debate, but there'd be an argument for racial gerrymandering. If African American candidates are routinely able to win elections in multiracial constituencies in which African Americans are a minority, as as Barack Obama was at the national level in 2008, then I think the need for racial gerrymandering is lesser. When racial gerrymanders began in the back in the late 20th century, there were far fewer African Americans getting elected in majority white districts. It was rare. It's less rare today. It's much more common today for African American or Latino or Asian American candidates to be elected in majority white districts. And to me, I mean, that's the ideal in a multiracial democracy, right? People of all racial backgrounds should be able to get elected in a multiracial electorate. And we're a hell of a lot closer to that in the 2020s than we were in the 1980s. Obviously, it's debatable whether whether the willingness of majority white electorates to elect African Americans is sufficient that we can let go of racial gerrymanders. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
not my area of expertise.
Yeah. I mean, I think multi-member districts is another way of dealing with this, right?
Yes,
And
agreed.
that's yeah. So
Part of the problem is plurality electoral systems. Yes.
right, exactly. So let's turn to one other topic between the two of us, and then we'll put it to the audience to ask some questions. So the other thing that happened last week is that there was an alleged assassination attempt on the president, and some senior federal officials at the White House Correspondents Association dinner in Washington, D.C. And that episode made me think a lot about the how to think about and talk about political violence in the context of backsliding. So unfortunately, there have been multiple attempts on the president's life over the past couple of years, all utterly condemnable. There have been other episodes of political violence, including the killings of several state Minnesota legislatures. Melissa Hortman, who is a alum actually of the Kennedy School, and her husband Mark Hortman, and John and Yvette Hoffman were also shot. The killing of Charlie Kirk last September, again, all utterly condemnable actions. I think, a couple of things tend to happen in the discourse when these events happen. First, there's usually an attempt to tie the action or the perpetrator to some broader conspiracy or movement. And I think one of the other thing that often happens is there's a broader kind of discourse about growing tolerance for political violence in the U.S. and a lot of talk about that. So I think I might say two things about that. The first is that even though there's some polling that shows some modest increases in support among some constituencies for political violence, most Americans, like an overwhelming majority of Americans, do not support it really under any circumstances. And that's true across the board, across every constituency. And I think that's the most important thing to say because another thing we know from public opinion surveys and things like that is that people generally overestimate the animus that others have toward them as people, and the willingness to engage in extreme actions toward others. And there is a real need to sort of bring the temperature down, I think, in general, around the sort of outgroup animus that can arise from such actions. But the other thing that I think is really important in a comparative context, having studied the sort of escalatory dynamics of political violence and state repression in many different countries, I think in a backsliding context, we should always be concerned about the ways in which such actions can later serve as pretexts for unjustified or disproportionate restrictions on civil liberties, like censorship of the media or censorship of speech, the targeting of opposition groups or political opponents, and other authorities that are given broadly to law enforcement to really crack down on a broader range of actors than those who might engage in criminal activity. And so, clearly, almost immediately, there were renewed calls for Jimmy Kimmel to be fired from ABC because he'd actually, a few days prior to the event, made a joke that was, in retrospect, relevant to the events. The targeting of opposition groups on his 60 Minutes interview, Trump kind of blamed the perpetrators' actions on No Kings, specifically calling out that he thought it was happening because of No Kings. And then, James Comey was actually indicted a second time, right, over a social media post that
Seashells.
right, the seashell post.
Seashells.
And so, like, I think that uh, there's always an interactive dynamic here. And in a backsliding context, we talked last time about the way that international war can create the kind of broader executive authorities at home that can lead to different forms of repression. And so can, an episode of violence domestically create that kind of context. And so, yeah, this is something that can, in some respects, or in some other cases, in the 70s, there was a lot of this, like, escalating kind of political violence and then major crackdowns by the state that ended up helping them to consolidate authoritarian rule. And that's yet another reason why political violence is condemnable, but also the unintended consequences can be quite dramatic for civil society as a whole.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I agree with everything you said, Erica. I guess just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, it is unfortunately true that anytime you enter a politics of extreme polarization, whether it's South America in the 1970s or Europe and Spain in the early 30s, or the United States in the 1850s, or the United States today, it increases the likelihood that extremists are going to take action, and it's incredibly important that mainstream civic and political leaders be crystal clear, very public, very loud, very clear that political violence under all circumstances has to be rejected. And I think at least until recently, most of our politicians have been pretty good about that. Frankly, Democrats have been a little more consistent than Republicans. But extreme polarization does bring increases in political violence and assassinations. And in the United States, we have to be clear, we are much more vulnerable than other societies because of the availability of guns, the ease with which individuals can get guns, and as well the sort of highly individuated nature of our society and the relative lack of support for people with mental health crises. And so a lot of free-floating individuals, relative to other rich societies, a large number of free-floating individuals who may be suffering from mental health problems and who have relatively easy access to guns, makes the United States much more vulnerable to this kind of assassination attempt than other democracies. Um, Unfortunately, that's going to come with the territory. The United States, one other thing to say about the United States is, unfortunately, because of those things, we've had a lot of experience with assassinations and assassination attempts more than other democracies. Most of us grew up in a period in which there were not many assassination attempts. So between the attempt on Reagan's life in 1981 and 2020, there were very, very few. And so, which is, good. So most of us are not used to assassination attempts, and it's a good thing that we're not used to assassination attempts. But if you look back at most periods of U.S. history, most generations of Americans grew up with a fair number of assassinations and assassination attempts. All of that to say, none of this is acceptable. It always has to be denounced by all of us, by all citizens, by our leaders. But the point that you make at the end is really important. In terms of democracy, the great threat is that this gets used by an authoritarian leading government to justify crackdowns. And the Trump administration has tried repeatedly. Thankfully, it hasn't been very successful, but it tried intensely after the Charlie Kirk assassination. There have been efforts around different wars to sort of to think about cracking down, and there have been a cluster of efforts in the last week, as you pointed out, to respond to this assassination attempt by going after Jim Comey, by going after others. And luckily, so far, they've been pretty unsuccessful at that. But I cannot stress to you enough how common it is in dictatorships to use either entirely trumped up cases of violence or real threats of violence as justifications to crack down. The vast majority of coups and authoritarian takeovers that we've seen in the last 50, 75 years have used some sort of a security justification. From Putin to Marcos to Getulio Vargas to the South American coups of the 70s. It's a very, very common theme. And so we need to be very vigilant when people like Stephen Miller talk about and of course, the key move, right, is to link the assassination attempt to the opposition party, to the mainstream opposition, which in this case, thankfully, there are no ties, zero, between the opposition party and violent activities. But the key to a successful crackdown is drawing that link. And unfortunately, Stephen Miller's been trying to do that for months.
Right. So let's turn to a few audience questions. One of them is, what do we think of a deep democracy agenda that is much more democratic decision-making at all levels of governance, including economic democracy, like workplace democracy, that could combine strong democratic process changes with a strong affordability agenda and ensure basically an economic democracy? What do you think, Steve?
Sounds great. Really hard to implement. There have been debates about economic democracy and workplace democracy and democracy in schools and universities for many, many years. I've always thought that it sounds great in theory. And the empirical record, not that it's been seriously attempted many times, but the empirical record is not great. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question about tomorrow's May Day protests. What will we be watching for to assess the effectiveness, and what are the prospects for broader economic non-cooperation? Maybe I'll take a first swing at this one.
Yeah.
So, as always, I think one of the things that's useful to look at when it comes to the National Days of Action is the number of locations in which they happen, the range of locations in which they happen, that is, whether it's all concentrated in large cities or whether it's spread out geographically, and the number of people who participate. as just the first order question of how much participation and support is on display and where. And the question of where is important because part of the sort of theory of change here is that the actions influence people where they live. And in particular, when it comes to an action like the May Day actions that are planned for tomorrow, when it's no school, no work, and no buying or no shopping, that's clearly going to have the greatest felt impacts exactly where people live. And so that's why the sort of number and geography of the locations matters. In terms of how we might evaluate its impacts, something like this is really hard to measure. Much harder to measure than, say, just a street protest or something like that, in part because it's harder to tally who all participates when participation functionally means staying away from things rather than going to things. And so this has always actually been one of those kind of methodological issues in studying protest movements and social movements more broadly, is like, how do you actually count that both how many people participate in and what the impacts of an economic non-cooperation action or a boycott like this might induce. I think that the logic of engaging in this type of action now is, from what I understand, to try to really gauge the movement's ability, the sort of broader No Kings coalition and others associated with May Day, to gauge the ability to coordinate single days of non-cooperation and to get bearings on what those days might look like. And the theory here is that in many different cases around the world, street protests are very important in drawing participation and attention to the movement's claims and changing the public conversation, but don't necessarily impose material costs on the opponent or their enablers, whereas non-cooperation does. And so I think that basically the idea of a national day of action to test the capacity for mass non-cooperation is in reference to those prior cases. In terms of the question of what it would take to get to broader non-cooperation, I think like any method, it depends on the movement's own capacity to coordinate across many different sectors of society. Labor would need to be involved and on board, and those outside of labor who are not organized in labor unions, but who are workers of various stripes, would also need to be involved and on board and prepared and everything like that. But I think, for tomorrow, I'm very curious to see how much participation there is and how many places. And I'm very interested to see also whether it mobilizes new constituencies for the broader movement. For example, I understand that there are planned walkouts from schools, and I'm very curious about like whether this is the type of thing that will get a lot of youth activation in this moment. Steve, what do you make of May Day, et cetera?
Well, you're the expert on protests, and I don't have too much insight into the May Day protests, but a couple of things. One, I really share your last point that it will be very interesting to see if this changes at all the generational mix or distribution of the protest, because one, I think, real concern about the overwhelmingly successful No Kings protest is there, a lot of gray-haired people like me. The young people have not been particularly well represented in these protests. And if a different form of protest yields a different generational mix, I think that's interesting and important. I also think that, even though the May 1 rally, may not be huge, may not change the conversation. It is important, and here I'm probably stupidly entering into your terrain here, but it's important to try out and develop new repertoires of contestation and street, good old-fashioned street protests that people my age are used to. We know how to do it. Um, it will continue to be an important part of the sort of civic repertoire, but developing alternative strategies, I think, is important. And um, some sort of non-cooperation strategy it's pretty radical. I think it's hard, but if this country gets into a real emergency where the government is trying to declare a state of emergency and cancel elections, and there is a need for a really sort of a different level of response than we've had, we're going to have to sort of develop the practices and the know-how to do it. And so, in that sense, I think this is positive. I think I've said this in another session, but I also think that although consumer boycotts have very often failed and very often not sort of achieved what they seek to achieve, I think there's a greater potential than ever before, given the extraordinary purchasing power of blue states, to put it in a simple way, um, as a political tool. And we saw it a bit after the first effort to remove Jimmy Kimmel from the airwaves, and I suspect we're going to be seeing more of it. I think it's going to be an important tool of political protest.
Great, I agree. We have a question about defections, broadly construed. And the question is, how are individuals who support illiberal regimes convinced to change their minds? So this strikes me as something that that's an interesting question, given your first book with Dan, about how democracies die, and the fact that really what unravels is a normative consensus, right, about self-restraint and mutual toleration and forbearance. How do you bring that back, or especially among those who have, who never bought into the normative consensus in the first place, and you're trying to get them to accept it?
Ah, um, you and I may have a slightly different take on this, Erica. When I think about adherence to norms, I generally mostly uh, think about elites, political, economic, civic elites. Um, Most citizens in most places, most of the time, are not thinking a lot about norms. And even when they vote for candidates, they're often voting for things other than sort of how these leaders behave democratically. And so my take on the question is that the way that you get an outcome like, say, Hungary, or the United States, where who holds power is still determined primarily by elections. These are, you know, competitive authoritarian regimes, but you have illiberals in power, and maybe a majority of the electorate voted for those illiberals. My take is that in the almost every case, a majority of voters didn't vote for illiberalism. People vote for lots of reasons, and they tend to vote for really mundane reasons. Often the inflation rate, or public services, or corruption. And so the simplest and I think ultimately most effective way of weaning or peeling voters away from illiberal political forces, which is absolutely critical. I mean, it was critical um, in Hungary. It was critical in Poland. It'll be critical in Turkey. It'll be critical in the United States. It's happening in the United States. The the best way to do it, the easiest way to do it, is through uh, performance. I mean, when people vote for liberals, not because they are liberals usually, but often because they're voting against some other status quo. And when these guys perform poorly, or when they cease to perform well, or when we can demonstrate that they have not acted in our interest, that they've been corrupt, that they've abused power, that's how you peel people away. You don't necessarily give them, I mean, it'd be great to give them a civics class and convince them that liberal politics is better than illiberal politics, but that's not usually how it works. People tend to they vote for the illiberal because of the price of eggs, and they vote against the illiberal, maybe because of the price of eggs, maybe because of corruption or other failures in power. So the real challenges are folks like Bukele in El Salvador, who at least for now is perceived to have performed really well. You'll notice it's been very difficult to peel people away from him. I think the level of corruption and abuse in El Salvador eventually will lead people to defect, but defection is much harder in El Salvador there because Bukele's delivered so well in terms of crime and security. But the defections usually happen for very mundane reasons because of performance, and that's what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah, very interesting. I think the question I have is about corruption as a frame. And it strikes me that corruption is even more abstract to people than democracy as a concept, but very vivid examples like calling it out exactly what it is: violations of the public trust, extorting people for personal gain, like those types of things somehow resonate more than the broad kind of behavioral and structural aspects of corruption. But I could be wrong. I feel like corruption is usually like a background condition for discontent, but not necessarily the primary motivator, unless it's tied to a very specific, vivid thing. Like even in Brazil, right? Like when Dilma was impeached, um, the there had been sort of broad claims of corruption, et cetera, for a while. And in this case, it was that Operation Car Wash, right? The specific like scandal that really was used to foment opposition to her presidency and ultimately to impeach her.
Even though she wasn't implicated in that.
Exactly. No, that was a pretext. And I think it was sort of like part of the movement that gave rise to Bolsonaro eventually. But I think the vividness of it is what did it for people, not necessarily the idea of corruption per se.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on this. I'm sympathetic to those like Adam Bonica at Stanford who argue that messaging and framing around corruption really could be quite effective. I think that you're right that in a lot of cases it is sort of a background condition, but where you have cases of populist or liberal governments that are that dramatically change the level of corruption, that are
Yeah.
clearly and demonstrably more corrupt than their predecessors.
Yeah.
Um, and in the case of Trump, really very nakedly, very openly corrupt, really old school.
Mhm.
I think I think that's less abstract than democracy, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it can be quite effective, and it has been in many cases. Now, if voters are convinced that everybody's corrupt, and this is a problem in the United States because
Right.
as we've talked about before, the extraordinary legal influence of money in politics in the United States is such that so many American voters have been convinced that everybody's on the take, that everybody's corrupt. That gives Trump a free pass. If Trump
Right.
can claim that he's just like everybody else, then you're never going to get him on corruption.
Mm-hmm.
But if we manage to convince people or to demonstrate that this is a different level of corruption, which I frankly think it is, um, I think that can do him a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very helpful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and make sure to join us for the next session of the breakdown, which we have scheduled for May 21st at noon. We will include a link to register and a follow-up email along with the recording of today's discussion. And Steve, as always, a pleasure.
It's great to see you and great to talk as always.